Please turn to your Pew Bibles on page 961. We'll be reading a segment from the second letter of Paul to the Thessalonians. We'll be reading verses 1 through 5, and then 13 through 17 on the following page. I'll read the odd verses, and you the even. As to the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, and our being gathered together to him, we beg you, brothers and sisters, let no one deceive you in my way, for that day will not come unless the rebellion comes first, and the lawless one is revealed, the one destined for destruction. He opposes and exalts himself above every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, declaring himself to be God. Do you not remember that I told you these things when I was still with you? But we must always give thanks to God for you, brothers and sisters, beloved by the Lord, because God chose you at the first fruits for salvation through sanctification by the Spirit and through belief in the truth. For this purpose he called you through our proclamation of the good news, so that you may attain the glory of our Lord Jesus Christ. So then, brothers and sisters, stand firm and hold fast to the tradition that you were taught by us, either by word of mouth or by our letter. Now may our Lord Jesus Christ himself and God our Father, who loved us and through grace gave us eternal comfort and good hope, and together comfort our hearts and strengthen them in every good word of the Lord. May the Lord bless this reading to our understanding.
Last week, I got a text message from back in North Carolina. It notified me about the passing of a man by the name of Buzz. He was a grandfather of two of my former students back in North Carolina, but Buzz was a little bit more special to me than that. Buzz served on the committee that elected me to come to Statesville and serve as the new youth pastor. Buzz was a quiet yet very practical kind of guy. He was humorous once you got to know him, and I spent several times over the last several days thinking about Buzz, thinking about the impact he had kind of played in my life. You know, when I first met him, I think about some of those first conversations that I have, and a few things just seem to come to mind. When I first met him, when I got called by the church to come up and do an interview, I remember meeting Buzz, and Buzz came up to me and he introduced himself by saying, "Hi, I'm Buzz, and don't bother asking me what my real name is because I won't tell you." That set the tone for how me and Buzz would operate for the next few years. While we were sitting at that same meeting, we were going around the table, and a lot of people were asking some questions about how I looked at doing youth ministry. How did I approach families? What did I think of maybe this book, or where did I come from? What did my studies kind of indicate of how I should approach this? And as we worked around the table, we got to Buzz. And Buzz looked at me, and while I was thinking another similar question was coming, Buzz threw this one out. "Do you have reliable transportation?" It was a good practical question. I lived 35 minutes away, and I needed a good car to make sure I could get back and forth. So Buzz asked the needed questions. But near the end, as things were beginning to wrap up, I remember one particular question that kind of threw me off that Buzz put out there. He looked at me and said, "You know, what do you mean, if you were to come here, what do you mean to get out of all this?" And it caught me off guard. It took me a few minutes to collect myself, and I'm a person that doesn't like dead air, and so I had to sit in silence for what seemed like an eternity. And finally, I blurted out, perhaps more honest than I meant to, with the most self-awareness I could muster, with a humble answer. I need someone to help show me how to do all this. You see, the first church I served at, I didn't have a pastor to kind of show me the ropes of what ministry was. I kind of got flung in. It was a sink or swim kind of environment. I was brought in and called to a position as a youth minister in eastern North Carolina. And within the first several months that I was there, the senior pastor was asked to leave. And so here I was, fresh out of crazy, right in the ministry, trying to figure out what I was doing and not really having anything to kind of guide me. And so I knew I wanted to change that. And it was kind of nice and freeing in some ways. I mean, Lauren could probably tell you, I got to try a lot of crazy things at that first church because there was no guidance. No one could tell me I was doing anything wrong. So it was kind of nice having that opportunity. But I missed out on some really good guidance that I know other people who had started with a mentor, they kind of had. I needed someone to walk beside me during that time. I needed someone to give me a little bit of direction. I needed someone to see those potholes or those sacred cows that form around congregations. I needed someone to kind of speak up to that and say, you need to let that alone, or you need to know what you're going into when you talk to this kind of family. You need to know the circumstances. I needed someone to encourage me and tell me that when things look bad, that it was going to be all right. I needed someone that could see through and say that God was going to be able to use my untrained eagerness to do some good in this world. Buzz got me to verbalize that what I really was looking for was a mentor, or what some might now call a senior pastor, or a coaching or a clergy peer of some sort. And I knew the church I was interviewing at had one of those. First Baptist Church had a man by the name of Nelson Grenade, and Nelson came there just a few years before and he had served at a church in North Carolina prior to that for about 20 years, and was really good at what he did. He possessed all the leadership skills that I just were not part of my repertoire. He was someone who I learned I could go with questions or to help me think through certain things, and I can sit here this morning to say he's still that person to me. Not long after I first came here, I got a call from Nelson. It was a missed call, and I got really scared because I'm a very pessimistic kind of person by nature, and I'm thinking, oh, Lord, something's happened back in Statesville. Like, what's happened? Something on? Did I mess up some kind of password? They can't use one of the computers. And so I immediately called Nelson back to ask what was going on, and he simply told me on the phone, he was like, hey, I was just calling to check in. How are things going for you? Is everything all right? Tell me about your people. How are things going? And so it was a really good timing the way that had played out. It was right before I was to do my first funeral here for Hattie Brown, and I was able to ask him, and he shared with me his perspective and shared with me his experience about what that looked like for his first funeral, doing it by himself, doing it solo. And it was knowing that I still had that connection with him. It was knowing that I was still able to receive his perspective. It got me thinking about what I saw in the lectionary text this week. Spending all that time and all those conversations with Nelson, that's kind of what led me to what I see in the lectionary text this morning. It was one day when I'd probably been there for maybe my first year. I was sitting and going out to lunch with Nelson, and we were having kind of just idle chit-chat or idle banter, and we were talking back and forth, and Nelson got kind of quiet as I began to talk about some of the things that I was hearing and seeing in our world, in our nation, and particularly the things that were drawing a lot of attention through the seminary that I was attending at the time. And so I found myself kind of unloading on him and just kind of talking about the state of things. Some of the things that were going on that year, it was kind of when Colin Kaepernick, we were talking about sports heroes earlier. Colin Kaepernick was gaining attention in the NFL. He is now a former NFL player who had begun in 2016 to kneel during the national anthem in a way that he describes as a peaceful protest. Something to draw attention to what he sees as racial injustices and systematic oppression, and that no one is doing anything about that. Now, of course, his time has grown into such a much bigger thing. He's been all over the news, and the media kind of skyrocketed him into fame that he never really just possessed as long as a player. And because of that, people have praised him as a hero. Everything from a hero to anything as low as anti-American. Some people have even vowed to stop watching NFL games until him and others like him are fired and removed from their positions. So that was going on in 2017, and I was telling Nelson about it. And then there were other much larger things. There was building tension with North Korea, and they were at that time openly talking about their pursuit and this development of constructing a missile that could reach U.S. soil. And from what I was seeing in the news, there was little diplomacy seemed to be being administered by the current administration. And the only thing that did come out of that was that if they continued to build missiles the way they were, with the objective of having something reach the U.S. soil, that we would offer fire and fury like the world has never seen. And that we would do that until they stopped this endeavor. I guess maybe what rooted in all the things are falling to pieces was that very week, what I saw in the news troubled me because it was so close to home. It happened in Virginia. White nationalists had gathered in the Emancipation Park in Charlottesville, Virginia, before a rally organized by a group called Unite the Right. The rally's purpose was to protest the removal of a statue honoring Confederate General Robert E. Lee. These alt-right protesters would chant such things in unison at this rally. They chanted things such as, "You will not replace us," and "blood and soil," easily seen as an English rendition of one of the Nazi Germany's most fervent chants, Blut und Boden. This was the cry of German nationalists and the Nazi Party and was intended to invoke patriotic identification with native national identity. Other cries range from White Lives Matter, an anti-cry, to the Black Lives Matter movement that was picking up steam at the time. And even saying such things and chanting in unison, "Hail Trump," as participants wore openly "Make America Great Again" hats. Later that same day, at that same event, a 32-year-old woman named Heather Heyer was killed, and more than 19 others were injured after a car driven by 20-year-old James Alex Field Jr. rammed into a group of counter-protesters who were demonstrating against the alt-right. All this was going on, and it was kind of stirring my spirit, all these different things, that things are just going to hell in a handbasket. I sat with Nelson that day just dumping on him, and I remember him just being very quiet and letting me kind of unload. And as I got to the end, I didn't know what else to say, so I just kind of put my fork down and lowered my head and said, I guess we're living in crazy times. We're living in crazy times. He didn't say anything at first, but then when he looked up at me, he said, Justin, all times are crazy. I got what he was saying. Yes, what we were going through in our world at that time was nuts, and it should leave me feeling like there was a horrific climax coming to a head, but others had lived to see such times in their lives too. We look around and what we see, and we begin to ask the question. When we have these kind of moments, we look around and we see all the things that are wrong in this world, and those of us of faith, maybe we start murmuring to ourselves, is this the beginning of the end? In our scripture this morning, we read the words attributed to the Apostle Paul. The church in the Thessalonian church were hearing some things. They were receiving some false teachings that had many of them agitated. Paul had written to this body of believers before and discussed the coming day of the Lord, which was believed to be a time that would see the righteous believers gathered up to be judged worthy and to meet Christ in his second coming. The frenzy these people were experiencing was because they were hearing that this was happening right now, to which Paul has to send a very hastily written letter and to remind them that while things might sound crazy, that they may already be experiencing hardships and persecution for their beliefs, that they should keep hope in their faith and know, through Paul claiming with his own authority, that this day had not yet arrived. Paul is telling them exactly what you don't tell a person who is worked up into a frenzy. You ever gotten somebody really worked up and then you tell them to calm down in the middle of it? Never works, right? Never worked for me. Like if Laura and I get in a fight, and I'm like, you just need to calm down. Like, smack across the face. Like, it's just not going to happen. It just doesn't work that way. However, Paul says this, and he begins to back it up with some reassurance and appeals to them that they haven't really seen crazy yet. there are some things that need to happen that haven't happened yet. And he points these things out in verses 3 and 4. We today really don't know the full context and how these verses were written. But for those living at that time, these claims that they might seem shrouded to us would have made sense to those there. Speculation has been given over the years of who the author of this text is referencing when they talk of the lawless one. Everything from the fictional Left Behind series and perhaps even the more fictional apocalyptic in-world works of those like John Hagee. But to get focused too much on the preciseness of this is to miss, I think, the bigger point. The author here is trying to offer perspective instead of accuracy in the form of pinpointed persons and events. And the desire appears to be one that calls the readers back from the edge of a very dangerous cliff. Paul is telling them to slow down, take a deep breath. Even though things seem bad, I'm telling you to remain not only calm, but I'm calling you to remain faithful, to hold fast to the traditions and the teachings you've been taught. This is said not to discredit what they are seeing or what they are feeling. This verbal bomb does not soothe immediately and doesn't change the fact that something caused their world to be shaken and turned upside down to get them asking the question of things surely can't go on or keep going on the way they have been. This was a reminder that crazy things were going to happen and they would continue to happen. And yet when they do, remember the promise I gave you. Hold on to your faith. And when you do, don't do it from behind walls and closed doors. Be out in the fray of things. Allow this same calmness to rest upon you as you traverse these storms that the world throws at you. Let your faith speak out of you, offering hope to all that come in contact with you. Don't let these negative cosmic forces drag you down. You're going to have to be above that. Now today, we hear terms like cosmic forces and our minds may not come to the same conclusions as those in the early church. However, I think we must pay attention to the significance of these suggestions. Perhaps evil has evolved, meaning some might no longer believe in a physical manifestation of a red-horned devil with a pitchfork. And let me say that there is danger when we reach that as a dismissing conclusion. Once a personification like the described devil is set aside and seen as unimportant, we mistakenly close the door all too tightly around the notion that catastrophe and evil are something very real. Famed scholar Walter Wink offers us a view for our time. What the ancients called spirits, what the ancients called angels, what the ancients called demons were in actuality real entities. Only maybe they weren't hovering in the air. They were incarnate. They were in cellulose. They were cemented. They had skin and bones. They were empire. They were mercenary armies. It might do us well in our faith to include the images of certain institutions today, maybe include certain nation states today, maybe include certain regiments today, maybe we should include unfair economic systems today, and any other formless entity that has power over the lives of people. Maybe we should call them evil. Maybe we should call them demonic. And if we are to speculate about a personified evil or lawless one as seen in verse 3, we might, in the words of Barbara Blodgett, say this. We might view this as a spirit of extreme arrogance embodied in anyone or anything that claims to be godlike, but is really just anti-God. Perhaps that's why these times like this, they trouble us, and these crazy times, they bother us so badly because we begin to look around and we begin to see that spirit. We look around and we see this sort of spirit everywhere. We see it most easily in those we view as our enemies, but we also see it in our neighbors. We see it in elected officials. And by God, we see it in ourselves. I'm here to affirm this morning that what you are seeing in this world, even now, is scary. Mass shootings continue. Minority voices are silenced. Washington is full of charlatans and whistleblowers. Reality stars can become president and might again. For any of those that follow any kind of pop culture news, Kanye West, the hip-hop artist, has mentioned he was going to run in the upcoming presidential election. He teased about this. West has just released a new album, Jesus is King, and it's become #1 on the Billboard. He's been just kind of a big deal and supposedly has brought a lot of people to ask the questions about their faith. And yet many have questioned his sincerity, and many have the right to do so, especially after he mentioned, after the dropping of the album, that he might change his name before he runs for president. He said he would change his name to Christian genius billionaire Kanye West. Now, if I see that on a ballot box, I don't know. I would love to just write it off and say that I don't have to participate in that, but what I can't do is ignore it. I have to engage it and say how horribly and absolutely crazy it is, while also reminding folks that crazy times are coming like this. And when they do, we must remember our faith. A faith that has called us to offer discernment, a faith that has called us to offer illumination, and in the right circumstances, offer resistance to the crazy powers and principalities we encounter. Imagine what that might look like. What would it look like to have the nation and its leaders say, what are we to do with the witness of the Christian church? We have been tasked with our faith to expose these sorts of spirits and all their multiple levels and hidden doors they operate within. This is a gift. This is a gift because it allows us to experience the type of freedom Jesus came to proclaim. A freedom that isn't regulated by military strength or self-righteous national laws that only protect some. Instead, it is one that smashes the idolatry of thinking that anything besides compassion and love can change the craziness we see today. Amen.